You will hear different arguments on the Holodomor. Some will argue that yes, a famine took place, however they will deny the fact that it was genocidal. And then you have some who go to the extreme and deny the Holodomor completely and say that a famine had never taken place. The purpose of this argument that I'm making, someone like Comrade Hakim argues that it took place because of weather conditions and denies the very fact that it had anything at all to do with the political centralisation of agriculture or Joseph Stalin in general. You have to attack the root of the problem, political centralisation of agriculture. Yes, I know you could argue yourself that the political centralisation of agriculture has to be carried out through force, and you could argue that yes, that is genocidal in its own right. And if we look at before the Industrial Revolution, that the cause of the problem itself was the political centralisation of agriculture, much like the antitrust myths, Thomas J. De Lorenzo, in the same book, How Capitalism Saved America, addresses upon this very issue, as he goes on to quote, "The first American settlers arrived in Jamestown in May of 1607. There in the Virginia Tidewater region they found incredibly fertile soil and a cornucopia of seafood, wild game such as deer and turkey, and fruits of all kind. Nevertheless, within 6 months, all but 38 of the original 104 Jamestown settlers were dead, most having succumbed to famine. 2 years later, the Virginia Company sent 500 more recruits to settle in Virginia, and within 6 months, a staggering 440 were dead by starvation and disease. How could there be a lack of industry? After all, the Virginia Company had not chosen a group of indolent and lazy people to settle in the Virginia colony. The problem was that all of the men were indentured servants who had no financial stake in the fruits of their own labour. For 7 years, all that they produced was to go into a common pool to be used supposedly to support the colony and to generate profits for the Virginia Company. Working harder or longer was of no benefit to them, and they responded as anyone would by shirking. Having been given free passage to the New World, these settlers were supposed to compensate the Virginia Company through their labour, so they effectively reneging on their contracts. As you can see, the very cause of the problem was the absence of secure private property rights. So in other words, they never got to work for the fruits of their own labour. To continue on, he says, Bethel points out that scholars have long recognised the link between the workers' lack of effort and the absence of property rights among the early American settlers. In the late 19th century, for example, historian Philip A. Bruce wrote of the Jamestown colonists, unquote, "The settlers did not have even a modified interest in the soil. Everything produced by them went into the store, in which they had no proprietorship." Off quote. As a result, Bruce wrote, the men idled over their tasks or refused to work altogether. Even men who were generally known to be among the most energetic by nature were derelict. The absence of property rights and of the work-reward nexus that such rights create completely destroyed the work ethic of the settlers. It's really all down to the communal ownership of property, because you're taking away the rights of the individual to own the fruits of their own labour. This is the problem with that of communists, with socialists in general. Socialists are often contradictory. On one hand, they acknowledge that human beings are all self-interested, and they acknowledge the fact that human beings are greedy, as they call them. They do not want to acknowledge and accept that for their communist utopia. And this self-interest defies their political centralisation, especially of agriculture. Just like those who were even the most hardest working people idled at their basic tasks. and were dying of starvation. And the very reason for that is because socialists don't like to accept the truth and reality that people do not work for the sake of other people. But what it really all comes down to is something of what we call the free rider problem. As Thomas J. DiLorenzo goes on to point out, economic historians Gary Walton and Hugh Rockoff aptly describe how such indolence can occur when workers have no property rights. Consider 10 workers who share ownership of the land and who collectively produce 100 bushels of corn, averaging 10 bushels each for consumption. Suppose that one worker begins to shirk and cuts his labour effort in half, reducing output by 5. The shirker's consumption, like the other workers, is now 9.5 bushels thanks to the shared arrangement. Though his effort has fallen 50%, his consumption falls only 5%. The shirker is free riding on the labours of others. The incentive for each worker, in fact, is to free ride, and this lowers the total effort and total output. You've probably heard the argument on the classroom experiment. It would not matter how many times you make this argument to that of socialists or communists. They're never going to accept it, and they will simply deny it, because they don't accept reality. Continuing on to back this evidence, as Thomas J. DiLorenzo goes on to point out, in 1611 the British government sent Sir Thomas Dale to serve as the High Marshal of the Virginia colony. Dale noted that although most of the settlers had starved to death, the remaining ones were spending much of their time playing games in the streets, and he immediately identified the problem: the system of communal ownership. He determined therefore that each man in the colony would be given 3 acres of land and be required to work no more than 1 month per year, and not at planting or harvest time, to contribute to the treasury of the colony. The farmers would be required to pay the colony a lump sum tax of 2.5 barrels of corn. Private property was thus put into place, and the colony immediately began to prosper. There was no more free riding, for each individual himself bore the full consequence of any reduction in output. At the same time, the individual had an incentive to increase his effort because he directly benefited from his own labour. As historian Matthew Page Andrews writes, unquote, "As soon as the settlers were thrown upon their own resources and each freeman had acquired the right of owning property, the colonists quickly developed what became the distinguishing characteristic of Americans, an aptitude for all kinds of craftsmanship, coupled with an innate genius for experimentation and invention." And this is the very problem with that of communists. They don't like to accept the real world and the disastrous consequences of their actions. And this is the very reason why, when you fast forward a good 200 to 300 years later, going into the 20th century, when the political centralization of agriculture took place in the likes of communist China or even communist Soviet Union, you saw the very same starvation problems. You saw the famines. That's why before the Industrial Revolution there were the periodical famines across the entire world. It wasn't until the enclosure movement took place, which is essentially the privatization of agriculture, that things began to change, and it led to that of the British population being enabled to increase over time. It tripled, and the life expectancy had more than doubled over the time period throughout the Industrial Revolution. When you look at that of the Holodomor, you can see that yes, in 1929 there was going to be the disastrous consequences of those actions. That is to say that when Joseph Stalin carried out the political centralization of agriculture with no private property rights, it was inevitable that people were going to die of starvation. So it's all an excuse when they say that there was some crop failure or that of poor weather conditions? Because if that's the case, could they explain the very problems that they saw in Jamestown, where they had a large cornucopia of seafood, wild deer and turkey to actually hunt, and fertile soil, and yet most of them were dying of starvation? You see, that's what it really all boils down to, is excuses to completely ignore the failure of their socialist policies.